Welcome to Lecture 5. Hope you're enjoying them. It's obviously a fairly amateurish performance by me, just using my iPad and a pencil and paper, but we do the best we can, don't we? Lecture 5, we're now moving on from microeconomics to macroeconomics, where macroeconomics is the study of economics on a national and an international scale. There'll be 6 lectures which will make up the full cohort of lectures on macroeconomics. We'll start with some measurements of economies so you know exactly what we're talking about. We'll look at then some of the theories about the way macroeconomics is understood and the policies that you can develop to manage economies. We'll look at the macro problems in economics, the imbalances that there are in the economy which lead to inflation, which lead to unemployment, which may or may not be improved by economic growth and may or may not be disturbed by external imbalances. We'll then look at the main macroeconomic policies for managing an economy, which will require us to look at monetary policy, followed by fiscal policy, and then we will look at one economy and how it relates to another through international trade. So what we're doing with macroeconomics is we're looking at the aggregates. You'll remember that we started in microeconomics by looking at consumer theory, which is individual demand in the economy. We added that all together and we got to market demand in the economy. We now add all the markets together and we get aggregate demand in the economy. Equally, we studied the supply side of the economy, and the small unit there is the theory regarding firms. Firms all add together to make industries, and then industries all add together to make the aggregate supply within an economy. So basically what we're doing is investigating the relationship between aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the economy. Now macroeconomics is good fun really, because there are a lot of arguments and a lot of debates about who's right with regard to understanding and managing a national economy or a number of economies in an international situation. So it's full of debates. There's some economists who see capitalism as failing and we need government intervention, and we need government intervention to increase. If you start with Keynesian economics and the followers of John Maynard Keynes, the Minskyites, followers of Chaim Minsky, the modern monetary theorists, and they all want to intervene and manage the economy because they don't think that capitalism can do a particularly good job on its own. There are other economists who see the main problems of intervention is almost overzealous governments, and they want less intervention and more capitalism. And you would usually associate the monetarists and the Austrians with this type of position. And there are models associated with both, and although I've already told you I tend to come down on the less interventionist side, I will explain the basic details of the more interventionist side so that you can balance them yourself against the less interventionist side, and you at the end of it all decide whether you think I'm right or whether I'm wrong. It doesn't really matter as long as I explain clearly both sides to you, and then you must make up your own mind. But the fun of macroeconomics, as I say, is a lot of disagreements, and I'll try and clarify some of those disagreements for you. So what we're going to look at just in this lecture is measuring the economy, if you like, trying to identify what an economy is. And it's done through national income statistics in one form or another. and when I originally gave this lecture it was entitled National Income Statistics, Useful or Useless? And that's the sort of theme that we'll be following through here as I try and explain to you the usefulness or the uselessness of trying to measure an economy at the level of the nation. You come across, whenever you look at this, you come across these three things here: Y equals Q equals E, where Y is a measure of national income, Q is a measure of national output, and E is a measure of national expenditure, and theoretically they should equal each other, because you could measure over a period of time the sum of all incomes in the economy, and you get a national income figure. You could measure the national output of the economy, look at all the production that takes place in the economy and measure that. Or you could measure the spending of that income in the economy, and they should all equal or be equal. They never are, so national income statistics have to have a lot of correcting numbers in them. But theoretically, national income should equal national output, should equal national expenditure over any period of time that you measure it. So you will come across that reference if you're looking at national income and statistics derived from it. Now, when you look at gross and net figures for national income, then quite rightly you should wonder what the difference is, because there's an immediate thought that this is something to do with taxation, but it isn't. When you see a gross number in national income statistics and a net number in national income statistics, the difference between the two is what's called capital consumption. That is the amount of capital that you've used up in the production process. Now, I should say here that capital means something very precise in economics. It's not the same as it might mean in banking and finance. Capital in economics is just a produced means of production. So a machine, a factory machine, a computer are produced means of producing other things. And in the productive process, you can use raw materials, you can use labour, you can use the brains of the entrepreneur, and you can use produced means of production. That's what capital is. Now, the important thing is that when you produce things over time, you actually wear out your capital. So it is important to consider always capital consumption. So a net national income figure tells you actually more than a gross national income figure. Let me illustrate why it is important. Let's take it right the way back, if you like, to an example in microeconomics, but it applies in exactly the same way. Suppose you are a taxi driver. Your produced means of production, the way you earn your money, is your taxi. Now, your taxi may last for 5 years before it has to be replaced. I'm not an expert, I don't know this. But if your revenues that you take from running your business cover all of your costs and set nothing aside for the fact that you will have to buy a new vehicle in the future, there'll come a point where your costs will suddenly increase because you will have to borrow money to replace the vehicle. So much better that you account for capital consumption every year by charging a fare, gaining revenue which covers all of your costs, including the capital that you're consuming, so that when you decide to replace your taxi, the money is there for you to replace your taxi. That's the efficient way to run your business. There is a problem, of course, about capital consumption, because there are two types of capital consumption in business. One is deterioration, so your vehicle will depreciate in value because it's wearing out through use, and the other is obsolescence, which is very difficult to estimate, but you would need to take that into account if you're really going to get this one right. And obsolescence is a difficult one because, for example, you could have gone out and bought the best possible diesel efficient taxi today, and then you find that tomorrow the government has changed the rule, and by the end of the week all cars, all taxis must be electric. So all of a sudden your purchase has no value at all. It's fallen, it's become obsolete in a few days, and that's very difficult to estimate. But capital consumption is very important. So when you're looking at gross and net figures, look at the net figures, because they actually tell you more than gross figures do. And remember, the difference between gross and net is just an attempt to measure how much capital has been consumed over the year or over the measurement period in terms of your economy. Now, the next thing that you will find when you look at national income statistics is they could be measured at market price, they could be measured at factor cost, they could be measured at constant cost, and all of these things are different and say different things, and you need to be aware of exactly what it is that you're looking at when you look at these three things. Market price measures are just measures at today's price, whatever it may be. It's a nominal measure of everything that's produced in terms of output, spent in terms of expenditure, or received in the case of income. Now you will find factor costs. Now factor costs try and take out the distortion caused by government, because they remove the tax element, the spending tax element, from a market price, but they add in any subsidies that the government might have been given. So if you're moving from market price to factor cost, you'll get a lower number because you've taken away tax, but you've added back in subsidies. Even more interesting than that is the constant cost or constant price measure of national income statistics. If you come across that, what you are not seeing is anything which is nominal. What you're seeing is real output differences, because what you do here is you say we're going to measure everything at this year's prices. Next year, the year after, we measure everything at this constant price, this base year price. And so when the numbers change, what you're identifying is how output has changed. So if you like, that's a real measure which sort of takes away any distortions caused by nominal adjustments in the economy caused by price changes. So constant cost measures are very useful, and what they actually tell you is how output is changing in the economy, and that is very important, because output is the real thing. Now you have been introduced just by that sentence to an idea that there are measures which we would call nominal measures, just measures in terms of numbers, and there are real measures which are changes in output, changes in goods and services, changes in real things. And nominal measures can go up and real measures can go down at exactly the same time. If your rate of inflation is 10%, then nominally your numbers have all gone up 10%. But if your economy is contracted by 5%, you've got 5% less output. So you've had a real contraction in your economy, but your numbers have gone up. At the moment, we've got a little bit of inflation with the pandemic. The pandemic has contracted output, so output has gone down because of things like lockdown and people reducing the amount of things that they buy or changing their patterns of consumption, but at the same time prices are going up. So it's always important when you're looking at things to remember the difference between nominal and real. 10% inflation means nothing other than prices have gone up by 10%. It's not telling you anything real. Now, in order to take your statistics, whatever you've got, and to try and change them from nominal to real, you can use what's called the GDP Deflator. And this, let me show you on here so that you're quite clear. The GDP Deflator is just a calculation. It takes the nominal GDP for this year, it divides by the real GDP for this year, the output measure, real GDP, times 100, and it gives you a number, and that number is the deflator. And once you've got that number, you've got that deflator, then you can take any components of national income and turn them into real numbers from nominal numbers. So if you wanted to know about health spending, you can put the nominal health spending this year, you divide it by the deflator, multiply by 100, and then you've got the real expenditure on health this year. So you're not confused by the nominal numbers which tell you the government is spending more and more on this and this and this, because you're looking at the real numbers. Are they really spending more? Use the deflator and you will find out. The one more thing that you might find, and therefore I'll explain, is the difference between measures which are described as national income figures and then domestic income figures, or GDP, gross domestic product, as opposed to gross national product. The word national is used and domestic is used, and again quite easy to understand. When you're looking at domestic numbers, you're looking at what you produce in your country. So it's a reference to domestic output, income derived from your output. It's not anything else other than what you've been producing in your country. Whereas national is what you've been earning in your country from both producing domestically plus another number which is called net property income from abroad. Now, it's a net number because there will be some people in this country who've got properties in Corfu or Spain, and when they're not there, they rent them out and they receive an income from them. So that income flows into this country. Equally, there'll be people in China and people in India and people in the Middle East who've bought things in the UK, and they will receive a flow of income from the UK. So there's income going both ways. For many years in the past, we always had a positive or a net positive number for property income from abroad. What it's like at the moment, I don't actually know, but it's certainly not as big as it used to be, and it may well be negative now. So when you change your domestic number to your national number, then you're going to add in any net increases from these flows in and out of the country, or take away if the flows are negative. So as you read through income statistics, always look very carefully and go, what exactly am I reading here? Make sure that you distinguish between the real and the nominal numbers. Make sure you know what market price measures are, factor cost measures, the difference between gross and net, and indeed constant price or constant cost measures. That's all very important when you're analysing and trying to deduce things from sets of national income statistics. Now, the next thing that you will come across, and I'll just say a few things about this, is the way that index numbers are used in measuring things in national income statistics, because index numbers make it easier to read and understand what you've got when you've got a set of numbers. And what index numbers do is they help you deal with a basket of numbers. It could be output numbers, it could be income numbers, it could be price numbers. Inflation is measured as a basket of products in in terms of their prices and their price changes over time. And so just a little mention here, because there's one big mistake everyone makes, which we need to tidy up straight away so that no one ever makes it after they've have listened to this. If you want to, well, let's suppose, once again, some numbers for you. Just suppose you've got 3 products. These could be products you're producing or consuming, it doesn't matter. You've got 3 products and their prices are 10, 15 and 10 for year 1. By year 2, A's gone up from 10 to 20, B's gone up from 15 to 18, C's actually gone down from 10 to 9. So with an index number, you're using a base number. Now you might say, why don't you use 0? That's a good base number. The reason you don't use 0 as a base number is because you can go below 0 and above, and then you've got to deal with minuses and pluses. So you always take your base number as somewhere where you won't get caught into minuses, and indeed if you ever got near minuses, you'd rebase it again to the original number. And the base number that you always choose is 100. So each of these items here, A, B and C, is given a base number 100. And in year 2, you add on the change or take off the change, which means A's, A's gone up by no, I've done this one wrong. Silly me. Let me just change it quickly. We don't want to hold those numbers up there, do we? Incorrectly. Let's take that one. And go 15. This will make life a little bit easier. My apologies for getting it wrong. If A had gone up from 10 to 15, then that would have been a 50% increase in the price. So the number goes up from, the index number goes up from 100 to 150. B, it's gone up from 15 to 18, which is a 20% rise, so that number, the new index number there, is 120. The third one has gone down from 10 to 9, so that fall from 10 to 9 is a 10% fall in price, so the index number goes down from 100 to 90. Now if you want the average of those three numbers, nice and easy, isn't it? You just add 150 to 120, and at 90 you get 360. You divide by 3, and you've got an average here for year 2 of price increases or output increases or whatever it is you're measuring. It's 120. In other words, on average, these numbers have gone up by 20%. Now, there's an assumption that's been made here, and that assumption is that each of these items, A, B and C, are equally valued, or they're an equal proportion of a total. If they're not an equal proportion of a total, then that number 120 is quite misleading. Now let me just illustrate that for you again here, because we've got our three index numbers. We've got the number 120, we've got 90, we've got 150. So A is 150, B is 120, C is 90. Now suppose 30%, suppose these were products you were buying, suppose 30% of your income was spent on A, 20% of your income was spent on B, and 50% of your income was spent on C. Now you can allocate weights. The weights you allocate could be in the proportion 30, 20, 50. I've just changed them to 3, 2, 5, doesn't matter. Whatever allocation, as long as you keep the right proportions. So my weights are allocated 3, 2, 5, and all I do is I multiply my index number for year 2 by 3, by 2 and by 5. So A goes up to 350, B goes to 240, C goes to 450, and we then add all of those up and we get 1040. Now those three items now have a total of 1040, and this is the mistake everyone makes. They go, this is not right, because they divide by 3 the number of products. You never divide by 3, you always divide by the number of weights you've allocated. So I've allocated 10, I divide by 10. If I'd allocated 100, I'd divide by 100. If I'd allocated 1,000, I'd divide by 1,000. Doesn't matter, you just always divide by the number of weights, not the number of products. And when I do that, the answer is 104. Now that actually means that these three products have risen on average by 4%, not 20%. Why? Because the most heavily weighted item on this was C, and C went down from 10 to 9. It went down by 10%, and that has brought down the average of these three products all the way down from 120 to 104. So you will come across index numbers quite a lot in national income statistics, and don't make the mistakes that I made when I started by miscalculating the percentage. So you take the original item, give it a base number, 100, work out the percentage change, add it to the base number, take it off from the base number. If you don't have to allocate weights because they're all equally weighted, then you can just add them up and divide by 3. But if they're not equally weighted, you've got to allocate weights and then multiply by the weights, add them all up and divide by the number of weights, and then you get the right answer. So index numbers are important in national income statistics, so do learn how to use them and don't make the sort of mistakes that you know who has just made. Right, the next thing that's important, because national income statistics on their own, what are they telling us? Are they actually telling us anything of any importance? And one of the things that economists do and people do is that they use national income statistics to be a sort of measure of standard of living. And you have to decide whether or not they would be useful measures of standards of living. And there's a little bit of use to them, but not a lot, of course, because a standard of living has lots of non-quantifiable things in it. So if you're trying to make a comparison, then there are things that are non-quantifiable and therefore difficult to consider when you're making comparisons. For example, just even the scenery and the climate where you live adds to your standard of living or detracts from your standard of living, depending upon whether it's very cold or very hot. Much better to be an equitable temperature, so it doesn't change much during the year. A pleasant temperature will be better and raise your standard of living than one that becomes extremely hot or extremely cold. Equally, the scenery may be important. You know that if you live in Switzerland, you get up in the morning, throw open the curtains, and looking at the mountains, you feel like a good yodel. And that raises your standard of living. Now, for me, living in Essex, throwing open the curtains and just seeing, well, nothing, because it's all very flat, I don't have that same incentive to yodel every morning as people who live in Switzerland have, and therefore that's part of the standards of living. In one country, there might be more stress in living than another country. That's very important in terms of your standard of living. In one country, people may work twice as many hours a week than another country, but only produce the same amount of things. So there's a big difference there, because leisure is an important part of your living standards. And I'm sure there are loads of people who love their work, and for them, being at work is the greatest thing that they can possibly do, and it raises their standards of living. But not for me, and not for lots of other people. For lots of other people, hours not working is more important than hours working if you want to think of living standards. And therefore, if you're comparing countries, if you have to work 50 hours a week in one country to achieve the same that you do in another country for 30 hours a week, then you've got a feeling that standards of living are different. And you can carry on the politics of the country, your government, whether they're oppressive and always telling you what to do, or whether they're happier to take you as a responsible adult who can make your own decisions. All of these things would really add to standards of living, and they're not measured in any way in national income statistics. So we need to bear all of those things in mind. But national income statistics are there, and year on year they change. So are they telling us anything useful? Well, on their own, in a very raw state, they're not telling us much other than a nominal number has changed. So you do want to get inside those numbers and try and work things out. For example, national income statistics have been kept since the Second World War in the UK, and they would have changed over time. But if you want to analyse them correctly, you would have to know that population has changed over time. So you're dealing with different sizes of population, and you might want to be looking at national income per head, not national income as a total number. The way you've collected statistics has changed. It's obviously in a computer age, collecting information is much easier than it would have been, go back 50, 60, 70 years. And quite a lot of estimates were put into statistical totals that may not be necessary now. Equally, we've had lots of inflation over the years. Go back in the 70s and you had 1 year of inflation which was nearly up to 30%. This change in the average level of prices, if you look at raw statistics, you'd have to take that out. You've got to remove that if you want to identify real changes in the economy. You've got balance of payments differences. That's the flow of imports and exports of goods and services. They produce deficits and surpluses. I'll explain this a little bit later in a later lecture, but if you're thinking of your standard of living and your national income, if you've got a big deficit on your balance of payments current account, then that's actually an advantage for 1 year. Your standard of living is higher than it would otherwise be. If you've got a surplus, it's actually lower than it would otherwise be. And it's one of those things in economics which on the face of it looks as though it's the wrong way round, which is why you always have to think very carefully about economics, because there are many things that seem on the face of it to be the wrong way round. So if you've got a balance of payments, current account deficit, you're actually better off during that year than if you've got a balance of payments, current account surplus. You also need to think about the distributions of income and wealth. Now, I've already described income and wealth to you earlier on. Remember, income is it's a stream. It's a every month, every week you get paid money, your income. Your wealth is just a measure of what you own. So obviously, if you're older, you have a lot more wealth than if you're younger, because you've collected and you own more things. Now, the distribution of income, if you're comparing one period of time with another, so you're looking back 50 years, if the distribution of income was much more unequal and now it's more equal, you would expect standards of living to be higher now with a more equal distribution of income. We have to be careful with that because it can actually give government the idea that redistributing income is a very good thing, because it's fairly obvious. If I remove, shall we say, £100 from an immensely rich person, it affects their standard of living? Not at all. If I take that £100 and I give it to a homeless beggar on the streets, that raises his or her living standards dramatically. So just a redistributive process can raise living standards. So if over time distributions are changing, then living standards would have changed without any change in the total. It's just within the total distributions are changing things. Equally, you would measure your national income in the same way if you produce consumer goods or capital goods. Now, consumer goods, remember, are all those things that help you make up your standard of living. The food you eat, the clothes you wear, the cinemas you go to, the ways you travel and enjoy yourself. They're all consumer goods and services, and they vary matched with your standard of living. Capital goods, not so, because capital goods might improve things for you in the future. If you set aside time now to build machines, Your standard of living is actually lower now, but it may be better off in the future because you've allocated this investment to producing more capital goods. Or it could be that capital goods and, unfortunately, defence items, war machines are also included as capital goods. And if I go out and build a lot of tanks and warplanes and submarines, then my standard of living doesn't improve at all. But national income will have gone up quite a lot, but unfortunately that sort of expenditure doesn't raise my standard of living. So it's important, if you're looking at, say, national income statistics during a period of wartime, standard of living is much lower because you're producing much less consumer goods, whereas after the war you'd expect it to be much higher as you stop producing these what we would call unproductive capital goods for the war effort, and you start producing more consumer goods. Equally, over time, working conditions will change. You'd look at numbers, but if you were working in a factory which was dirty, dangerous, dangerous to your health, then over the years that's changed to a very clean environment. Then that clean environment improves your standard of living considerably as opposed to a dirty environment. So if you looked at, say, car manufacture 50, 60, 70 years ago, it wouldn't have been it would have been a noisy, dirty and probably even a dangerous environment to be working in, whereas today when you look in a car factory it would look quite a pleasant place to work for any of you who have seen it or work in it. Equally, another thing that is not measured just by a raw set of national income statistics is how individual products have improved, changed, the quality of the product, how it has changed over the years, and indeed the number of new products that have come onto the market over the years. All of those things will affect your standard of living, and you can't really draw it out of any set of national income statistics. So, can national income statistics illustrate what's happening over time in a country, or just a little? But you've got to bear in mind lots and lots of things that you would need to change and add to make this more clearly a reflection of living standards. Now, it's quite common, I mean, we shouldn't talk about examinations, should we? I'm only just introducing it to the subject, but it is quite common in examinations to use questions in the national income area and ask you to compare their usefulness as ways of determining living standards. And there's one added complication if the question asks you to do it not in one country over time, but to do it between countries. And if you do it between countries, then there are lots more things you have to take into account, as well as all of the things we've said so far. Because if I want to look, say, at the national income of India, it's measured in rupees, whereas the national income of the UK is measured in sterling. There's no direct comparison whatsoever. I've got to try and find a common currency or a common way of making this comparison. And that's, in one sense, easy, but the easy option is not the best option here, because as long as there's a foreign exchange rate between the rupee and sterling, it's an adjustment that I can make. I can look at numbers in rupees and numbers in sterling, and I can make the necessary adjustment through the exchange rate. However, exchange rates are actually not good measures of purchasing power between countries. Again, it's another lecture if I wanted to explain this to you, but take my word for it. If you want to look at a purchasing power parity between countries, you get a better idea of the differences in living standards. Now, all a purchasing power parity means, if I take, shall we say, £100 and I go into Marks and Spencer's in London and I buy £100 worth of things, and if I take my £100 and change it into rupees, how many rupees will I need to go into Marks and Spencer's in Bombay and buy exactly the same items? that's a purchasing power parity. But if you look at that and then look at the exchange rate, you'll find that they're probably two very different numbers. So the exchange rate is just a crude way of making comparisons. A purchasing power parity is a much better way of making comparisons between countries. If you take their national income statistics and can estimate purchasing power parities and adjust for that, then you will be closer to making a comparison that people can grasp and understand. Also, you will find if you're comparing countries that just methods of collection differ. You may well be in a poor country, where it's very difficult to collect any statistics at all, where it's a currency that's not traded internationally on foreign exchange markets, so it's very difficult to make comparisons. You could have a situation, for example, a country like Russia measures its national income by looking at goods only. It doesn't look at services, which is all right over time for them when they're looking at how things are changing. But if one country like the UK is measuring their national income in goods and services, and they're measuring their national income in goods only, the comparison becomes very difficult. So think of all the things that we said just for looking at one country over time. Between countries, add lots of other things on as well if you really want to use your national income statistics as a source of information about whether or not one country is better off than another in terms of its standard of living. There are things that you can add to national income statistics to get a better measure of an economy and a better measure between countries. So there is a human development index which takes a real gross domestic product number, which would be, when it says real, one's looking at output, not a nominal number. It takes a real GDP and it adds a number for life expectancy, which is very important, isn't it, as far as living standards are concerned, and varies significantly between countries. And it also adds a number for educational attainment. Both of these things are quite important, and they're used to develop a human development index. There's a measure of economic welfare, which is slightly different. That takes real GDP, and it adds a number in for leisure time. As I said to you before, if you get a higher GDP and work less hours for it, your standard of living is better. So an RGDP, a real gross domestic product, plus leisure time, plus unpaid work is included in this one, but you have to take off environmental degradation to get this particular number. And there's an index of sustainable economic welfare, which takes expenditure, but it adds private expenditure to public expenditure. It then adds in the unpaid work, but it removes defence spending. It doesn't consider that to be good in terms of your living standards, and it again removes environmental degradation as well. So you can get better numbers if you take raw statistics and start to add some things to them. You can get stronger idea. There are other ways of doing things. Some will just ignore national income statistics at all, and there are happiness indices and misery indices which people develop just by going around the street, seeing how often people smile and how happy they are or how miserable they are. Probably the misery one at the moment is quite high with everyone's concern about the pandemic, but that's really the last point that I want to make, because what we've done here is we've said, yes, you can measure economies. The way you measure economies, there are lots of different types of measurements that you need to take into account. And then we're going on to say, is this raw data useful? Well, not really on its own. It's got to be refined and added to, and we've got additional data that we need to add. So it's useful, but only up to a certain point, which was really what I was looking at right at the start. Are these things useful or useless? Well, probably useless unless you refine them, unless you add to things. But that tells us a little bit about the reality, if you like, of what an economy is, how it measures and how it may be changed over time. The next lecture, we're going to look at some of the theories about the way the macroeconomy works, and this is really where the debates and the arguments start. So I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you very much.